Thanks for tuning in. We're Ace Comicals. I have with me my co-host Rahul Jani and Leon Everett. I'm Greg Driver. Let's get started. Hi guys, welcome to Ace Comicals. This is the first show of 2017, episode 001. We decided this would be a great way to kick off the reboot of the show by talking about how comics work and how we got into it a little bit. A gentle introduction for people who are curious about comics and to address some of the things that we wish we'd been told when we first got interested in comics, because it can be a confusing place.
Yeah. Comics are difficult to get into, I think, sometimes if you don't know where to begin.
Comics are hard when you walk into the shop and you just look at the shelf and you see all these different things and it's just like, where do I start? I just wanted to read a Spider-Man comic, but damn, So,
it can be an intimidating experience at the beginning.
It can. And that's kind of what the point of this show is, to kind of take some of the sting out of it, I guess. So I'm going to hand over now to my co-host Rahul, who... he's going to be the lead on this one. So take it away, Ray.
Thanks, Greg. Right, so it's not going to be a list of books to read, because there are plenty of resources online which can give you recommendations of great graphic novels to read first, though towards the end of this show we will mention our favorites. Instead, this is going to be more of an explanation of the aspects of the comics industry that we came to learn throughout the process of getting into it. And coming to understand comics ourselves. So between the three of us, we have varying degrees of expertise and submersion into the hobby. In my opinion, Greg is the most encyclopedic in his knowledge of comics, not just of the three of us, but like of anybody I know. So he's a great resource for finding out where to go next, and any small questions I have on comics, I turn to Greg. Leon, I think, has the most formal education in media and a passion for deconstructing stories. And I myself, I'm predisposed to just loving anything that's put in front of me, and I love reading comics, and I love watching films, and I just love absorbing stories. So comics are great for that. I remember a moment when I got my first proper job after graduating, and I bought my first tablet, which was a Nexus 7, and I wanted to read some Spider-Man comics digitally, and I had no idea where to begin. So I went to Wikipedia to find the Spider-Man comic to read, only to find that this made things more confusing. There was a heading for the ongoing series, the previous series, the limited series, one-shots, crossover events, collected editions, annuals, trade paperbacks, blah, 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 blah. I don't know about you guys, but I found this incredibly intimidating, and I had no idea where to begin. Do you have a similar story for this?
Yeah, this happens to me a lot whenever I hear about a comic or a comic series, or whenever I hear about an event I should read, and then I try to first place you head to, Wikipedia, first place that comes up in Google. I head there, and it just makes it 10 times worse. There's no proper information, there's no proper linking, there's no interweaving encyclopedia that makes this all clear, because the continuity of a lot of these, especially with the big, long-running superhero comics, are just indecipherable and impenetrable. So I've had that issue a lot, and I've gone to other resources, other sites out there, and it just feels like a big patchwork, really. There doesn't seem to be like one main place to go where I can just know where I am, see some sort of chart, and see how that connects to what came before and what came before and what came before. So it just makes starting itself almost impossible.
I think. No, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say I don't think that I was that methodical and that kind of organised and planned when I got into it, because I wasn't thinking about it like that. I was just maybe I'd seen a Spider-Man cartoon or something, and I'd be like, okay, that's cool. I want to know more about that bad guy. So I'd look for something with that bad guy, and I'd read about that bad guy, and then I'd look for comics where that bad guy appears, and I'd probably read one of those stories and do it that way.
Well, see, I think my barrier to entry was I wanted to know which story to get into, but in trying to find the right story to begin with, people were explaining all these different terms, and there's all this nomenclature that's specific to comic books. So there's all these terms and no clear place to begin. So I think that's the place that I'd like to start.
Yeah.
So let's begin with the different types of formats. And by formats, I mean the various ways in which a comic is published and sold. So when you think of comic books, you may think of the thin floppy pages, which are often shown in TV and film. So for example, if you've ever watched The Big Bang Theory, you'll see they go to a comic book shop quite often, and they're flipping through these archive boxes and pulling out these plastic wrapped, individually sealed comic books. These are called periodicals, or most commonly referred to as issues, sometimes floppies. So for any particular story, a single issue is generally released about once a month. A loose analogy is that they are like a single episode of a TV show, except instead of getting one episode a week of a TV show, you get one issue of a comic book per month. The regularity of releases varies depending on the publisher, the writer, etc. But once a month tends to be the standard. I think sometimes you have long-running comics, they have hiatuses in between their runs, but that's a different story. We can get to that later. Specifically, new issues are released on a Wednesday, aka Comic Book Day. And I know Greg in particular looks forward to Wednesdays a lot for this, right?
Like
you go to the comic book shop every single week.
So yeah, I have like a few different comic series that I follow, and they obviously, like, within a month, each week there's different releases, so you get one a month of each one, but like they all come out different weeks, and it's usually a Wednesday when they put them on new on the shelves. So I have like a running subscription type thing going, where I'll go into the comic store and I'll be like, okay, so when the delivery comes in, can you pull this and this for me, because I'm collecting these and I don't want to miss one, because it's really annoying if you miss one. So because then going back to try and find it is pain. So I go in and I pick them up every Wednesday, and that's kind of like the little sort of bit of joy in my week, going to the comic book shop and getting my new comics. It's great.
As it should be. Yeah. I love going to the comic book shop.
Like when you sit down at night and your favourite TV show is going to come on and it's the next episode and you've been looking forward to the end of the cliffhanger. So, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I have the same feeling, but I collect comic books digitally for the most part. But again, we'll get to that a little bit later on. So going back to these single issues, the periodicals, a single issue is generally a little bit smaller than an A4 sized page, I'd say, maybe a bit thinner. Usually consists of about 30 to 35 pages total, with about 25 pages dedicated to the story comic content. Almost universally read in portrait format and from left to right. There may be a few pages at the center and or back for adverts, and generally 5 or 6 pages of non-story content. For example, the fans' letters to the writers. Adverts, I don't know if that's necessarily true anymore, actually. The only times I've seen adverts at the back of comics now is advertising other stories by the same publisher.
That's because you read a lot of Image comics, I think.
That's
publisher,
true,
yeah. Because I mean, so you know, like the bigger ones like DC and stuff. You'll get like, it's usually comic centric adverts, like DC centric adverts, but like there's Snickers adverts in my Batman comics. You know?
Really?
Yeah.
Okay. Cool.
So,
cool. I'm gonna have to check that out. I mean, about the content you have at the back end of the comics, do you guys have any favorites? Like, for example, I like Brian K. Vaughan, who's a very prolific comic book writer. At the back end of his saga issues, like every year, he drops in a questionnaire that he likes his fans to answer, and then the next issue after he comes back after the new year, he responds and explains which were the most popular questions, which had the most popular answers and stuff. Do you guys have any examples of that?
My favourite one, again, Brian K. Vaughan, is what he's done with Paper Girls, where he's encouraged people to answer questions as if it is still that time period. So Paper Girls is set in the 80s, and he's encouraged people to like write in with stamp addressed envelopes and do the whole 80s kid thing, you know, and talk about being a paper boy or a paper girl back in the 80s. And I thought that was kind of cool, because it's like, I think it's the most it's because I like the theme, basically. I like the fact that it's got a theme and it's encouraging people to interact. It's like, you know,
and I think it's something that's fairly unique to comics, in that it's the method of interaction with the audience is very specific that way, and there's something to look forward to, and you know where to do it. I like that about comics. So issues. So all the pages are printed, folded, and stapled at the spine in the same manner as maybe a short magazine or a newspaper. So generally, these issues run in sequence, once a month to complete a single arc. So to continue the analogy, these arcs are equivalent to one season or series, depending if you're British or American. What do we say? Season in the UK? One season of a TV show. As with TV, the length of an arc is entirely dependent on the story, and comic books are a bit more flexible with their definition of what an arc would be. So a rule of thumb is that an arc is roughly 5 to 7 issues long. And I mean, there are exceptions to this rule. A long-running serialized comic, for example, The Walking Dead, doesn't necessarily follow a strict arc format. It just continues on as one long continuous story, like maybe a serial soap opera. Like,
yeah, so
it's the EastEnders of comics.
Yeah. you could take something like so we'll take something simple. We'll say, like, I don't know, Spider-Man, right? And an arc in a Spider-Man comic might be 3 Spider-Man comics where it's a story involving a particular villain like the Vulture and how Spider-Man overcomes the Vulture. So in those 3 comics, start to finish, that's the Vulture arc of that particular. So it's like those 3 books, and then it comes to an end, and he's beaten the Vulture, and that's that arc over. Then he moves on to the next villain. So that's the arc. The arc is like a smaller story within a bigger story.
Yeah, like the beginning, middle, and an end that you can collect together. So moving on to the next bit then. So when the writer and or publisher deem it fit, a sequence of issues, generally a complete arc, as we just described, will be collected into a single trade paperback, also known as a volume or a collected edition. I personally like to say volume. I know, Greg, you prefer the term trade paperback. You use it a lot, but I find that a bit of a mouthful. But I'm going to try and stick to that because I think that's the correct term. Is that right?
Well, I don't know. Like call it whatever you want. I just shorten it. I just shorten it to TPB, and because I know that the actual book it's called a trade paperback, so I just call it a trade paperback. Yeah. But I think if you want to call it like Volume 1 of Black Panther or Volume 1 of Spider-Man or Volume 1 of you can do it that way. But like,
I mean, generally people will know what you're talking about if you say either or the other.
Yeah.
So trade paperbacks, they are thicker and sturdier than a single issue. They resemble thicker magazines, though of higher quality, not quite as floppy, better paper, better printing, generally like quite sturdy. And the individual pages are cut and glued together at the spine, as opposed to stapled with issues. These trade paperbacks are often given their own title in the manner of a novel. So, for example, Greg mentioned Black Panther. The new 2016 Black Panther run was simply titled Black Panther during its monthly releases. But the first collected edition, released in August 2016, which collects issues 1 to 4, is titled A Nation Under Our Feet Volume 1. The second collected edition, released in January 2017, collects issues 5 to 8 and is called A Nation Under Our Feet Volume 2.
Book 1 and Book 2, yeah.
Or Book 1, Volume 1, trade paperback. So this naming convention of A Nation Under Our Feet, in this example, the naming convention will likely continue until the writer deems a title change, either for creative reasons or to highlight the end of a particular story or arc. The collected editions may not always have exactly the same content as the issues they collect. So what was you just mentioned one, Greg, or we discussed this earlier, that the Black Panther collected trade paperbacks don't have a particular sequence of images at the start which explains which character is which, so their face against their name. Or, for example, the Saga volumes, collected editions, do not contain the fan letter pages, which we mentioned earlier. But instead...
I mean, like, if you stack up a pile, like the 4 comics that make up the trade paperback, it will feel thicker. But that's because they cut out all the adverts, they cut out all the fan letters, they just keep it to the story pages. And maybe put in some of the exposition at the back, like things you might find interesting. You usually get a little bit of extra stuff at the back of a trade paperback as well, with like concept drawings and concept art for character costumes and things like that. So also,
a little bit of behind.
Collect together all the covers at the back as well, and you get all the alternate covers as well. Because usually when you buy a monthly comic, there's not just one cover design. There's several cover designs that you can get for that one comic, because you can choose the cover you like and buy the cover you like.
I like when they collect together all these behind the scenes or like the alternate covers and stuff at the end. Right, so alongside the trade paperbacks, we have what we can broadly call graphic novels. So whereas trade paperbacks collect a series of issues released over a long period of time, a graphic novel is generally released in one go and is specifically written to be consumed as a whole. So the closest analogy, as the name suggests, is a written novel. The length of a graphic novel can vary depending on the writer or the artist. The story generally has a beginning, middle, and an end, all contained in that one book. But like with books and films, they may later spawn sequels, prequels, whatever. A physical shape of a novel can be drastically different. This is, I think, one of the big differences between a trade paperback and a graphic novel. A graphic novel could be softbound, hardbound, arranged in landscape mode, which is pretty unusual when discussing trades or issues. For example, like the shortest edge could be bound in on the side, or it could be presented in portrait mode, similar to a trade paperback. Or the variations are limitless, essentially. Loads of cases of books which are considered as singular graphic novels, but they originally began life as a short run of issues. For example, Watchmen started life as 12 individual issues, but the main way that you see it for purchase now is as one big, thick book, which runs seamlessly together. I don't know if you guys have any examples of like other unusual graphic novel types.
I think... I don't know if you could call Batman Nightfall, a graphic novel. I don't know, because it's a collection of 3 big fat graphic novels, but it collects together a particular chunk of Batman comics that deal with a particular storyline, and it's collected together under the Nightfall banner. The story is called Nightfall, but originally it would have just been published as Batman and
it's huge as well. Like it's much bigger than a traditional trade paperback, which would be.
Yeah, you get that with like collections of the old classic Marvels. So like you can grab what looks like an Argos catalog size of like Spider-Man or X-Men comics, and it will be like Amazing Spider-Man 14 all the way up to like 52 or something like that.
But it doesn't necessarily, those ones aren't necessarily start to end. They're more of an omnibus.
Omnibus, that's a good way to describe that.
They're actually called, they usually call them an omnibus. So you got like I think the ones Leon was referring to are usually like called like Essential Spider-Man or something like that, and they're usually referred to as an omnibus because it's literally every single Spider-Man comic from 1 to 20 or whatever in one big book.
I guess these omnibuses, if you really want to dive in deep, would be a good place to begin. If you can
find omnibus that starts at number 1 and
Okay, so I think we've covered all the general formats. I guess we can move on to addressing what I consider to be the most confusing aspect of comic books. So that's the different properties and their continuities. So comic books, as we know them, have been around since the 1930s. It's been around for forever, from my perspective. So in this time, loads of different stories have been told by loads of different people through many different publishers. And over the years, these stories sometimes need to find new ways to refresh themselves. So in the same way that we have movie sequels, prequels, reboots, remakes, comic books follow the same trends. In fact, they've done so long before movies did it, and they get even more complicated than movie reboots and sequels and prequels can get. So I think one of the main things to be aware of is that the different stories and characters and settings are generally attached to a particular publisher. So, for example, your favorite childhood characters are likely still represented in comic book form. So, for example, we've got a publisher called IDW, and they publish Ghostbusters comics, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle comics, Transformers comics. They're currently ongoing. They're still producing new content based under these properties. We've got Image Comics. They do The Walking Dead and Spawn, amongst many others. We've got Dark Horse Comics. They do Alien vs. Predator, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Sin City, Xena the Warrior Princess. The list goes on. I've only mentioned the comics that have crossed over into TV and or movies, but know that one of the most wonderful things about comics is that each publisher has an amazing spread of lesser known properties, and they're all brimming with different ideas and like stories that you wouldn't be able to see in any other medium. And I think that's the magic of comics in a nutshell, is that it's its own medium, it's unique, and you can't find these stories easily presented anywhere else.
There is literally something for everyone because there's somebody who there's literally something for everyone because there is somebody who thinks like you, who has made a comic that so that's the great thing about it. There's something for everyone. It's not like say television or film where they produce something and it has to appeal to a mass of people, because the great thing about comic books is they don't have to appeal to a mass of people, because you can just create what you want to create and you put it out there, and if people don't like it, they don't like it, but someone's going to like it because it agrees with somebody.
Yeah, so I think it's easier to cater to an audience with comics because there's not so much risk. Like, for example, like you mentioned, TV shows, and you have to put all this money into appealing to the largest audience so you can make your profit back. Comics, I think there's a smaller margin of error that way. Like you said, there's something for everyone, and creators aren't afraid of putting their ideas into a comic because they're, it's a relatively easy and cheap way of producing content compared to TV and film.
It's a nice, progressive, inclusive medium as well. People aren't scared to print what they want to print. People aren't scared to use their freedom of speech and whatever else. So I
think that's also true. It's because the comics sit on the sidelines a little bit, not as much as they used to anymore, but they still kind of do. They're an outside medium. And so it's easier to be more inclusive without fear of backlash in comics. Right, so for the sake of simplicity, breaking down the different continuities, we're going to focus on the big two, which pretty much everyone will be aware of. But know that the same general rules apply to any other long-running properties from different publishers. An example of this would be Judge Dredd, where there's hundreds and thousands of different stories and runs and continuities and reboots and whatnot. But I'm going to hand this over to Greg because he's, like I said, the most encyclopedic in his knowledge of comics, and he'll explain to you about the big two, Marvel and DC.
Right, so the way this works is, we'll start with runs. So a run is a number of comics about a set of characters or a singular character, usually by a specific writer and with regular artists to give a sense of conformity. So you'll have a single run that spans as many comics as it needs to, 50 comics, 20 comics, whatever, and that'll be by a singular creative team, a writer and artist, and that will deal with one character or a group of characters. So the X and Y run of Hero J or whatever, and that's how people will refer to it. They'll say the Frank Miller run of Daredevil, because it's Frank Miller that, Frank Miller was part of the creative team, so they'll call it the Miller run of Daredevil because it was the one that he worked on. And a run usually has a start and a finish, and because he's after that, the creative property, the character, will be passed on to the next writer and artist to work with. So you'll have the first. So imagine easiest way to explain this is if when you're a kid and you play this game where you write part of a story and then you pass it on to the next guy to finish the next part of the story. It's kind of like that in a sense that one creative team will work on a run. They'll go start to finish. There'll be an ending, but they'll leave a little tiny bit of thread that the next guy can pick up and work with. So the next people come along and they take into account everything that happened before and then write the next chunk of the story. And then the next creative team will come along. And these are runs. This is how you split something into runs, basically. Now, a run will more often than not start with number one and then come to a logical conclusion. As I've explained, a new run might begin with where an end point is reached and a new creative team takes over the story, taking it back to number one. If you try... Now... This is the next part, and they keep adding a chunk and so on. So if you try to imagine this, but with you taking the story to an end point and then the next person picking up the thread, as I've explained. Now, building on this, imagine you have 5 characters and you've been playing this game with, and you decide to cross all 5 into one story. So 5 characters, each with their own runs, and then you've got these 5 threads, and you want to make them into one story. And that one story changes the very fabric of the universe they all inhabit, something that changes things for the better or worse and has a profound effect on everyone. This is what we call a crossover event. So you're crossing over the 5 stories into one big event where it affects everyone. The individual stories continue, but where they intersect, you get a separate story that probably lasts a few issues and contains all of the characters. Following this, depending on how profound the event is, you might, more often than not, get another start over with new number 1s. So you get 5 characters cross over into one big story, someone dies, something happens to the universe, and then everyone goes back to number 1 again. And we start with a new creative team working with number 1. So it's a new universe with a new status quo and a new creative team working with each character, and something will be slightly different, like this time character X is a woman instead, or something like that. And this is where it starts to get really confusing, actually, if it isn't already confusing enough, because you can have 2 or more separate runs about the same character that inhabit different universes, if that makes sense. So if you imagine 2 groups of people start with the same character and play the same game, where they're adding bits to the story, but it's something slightly different in the other one. So you've got 2 people playing. So you imagine, like with Spider-Man, you've got Ultimate Spider-Man and you've got Amazing Spider-Man, and it's the same character. It's just 2 different ways of telling that story, and something slightly different between one and the other. Now.
And I was going to say that sometimes these crossover events can be used to unify stories that have gone far too disparate to be manageable anymore. I think there's a lot of instances where the writers have kind of backed themselves into a corner, and they think, oh, let's do this one unifying event, and then maybe we can bring the stories back to point again, and then continue on with a bit more sense. Yeah, and that happens. I think that happens quite a lot, right?
It's a way for them to just sort of like clear the slate and get back to basics usually, and it's helpful as well because this is where you bring new readers on. So this is a good place to get started after an event when it all shoots back to number 1 and it's nice and simple again.
What are some of the more famous crossover events in Marvel and DC's history?
So well, for
because this is one of the things that I was really confused by when I first started. I had no idea. I'd heard of the terms like New 52 and Rebirth and such and such, and I still don't quite get it. I don't know.
I think the way that works is you've got the New 52 and Rebirth and whatever are different universes
in the DC universe.
Yeah, So within the DC, so like I was explaining, you've got people playing with the same characters doing the same thing, the same game where they add bits to the story, but they're doing it in slightly different ways, and that's why you've got there's a with Rebirth, the whole point of it is something happens and then something has changed so that it's now slightly different, and we go back to issue 1 for each character, but something's missing and something's different. But crossover events, I'm talking about things like Marvel Civil War, where the whole universe gets involved, and then after Civil War you've got the fallout of that and the repercussions and how that affects each character.
And that sets up a new jumping on point for new readers. To refresh the continuity.
Yes, yeah. Now sometimes, like as I was explaining, you've got these separate universes, and as I've explained, one event that's happened in one universe might not have occurred in another. A good example of this might be a death of a family member that was pivotal in that character's decision to take a specific action. So in one universe, that character dies, but then there might be a separate universe where, what if that character didn't die? This is what happens. So these separate universes are what we refer to as continuities, basically. So it's like different continuities. So you've got one, like the ultimate continuity of Spider-Man, and then the Amazing Spider-Man continuity, if that makes sense.
But they can be considered as 2 separate stories, essentially. That run in tandem.
They can be considered as 2 separate stories because that's basically what they are. They're just two different ways of telling the same story, but they inhabit the same multiverse. Because you've got all these different universes, all these different continuities, and you've got the DC multiverse and the Marvel multiverse, which is all of it collected together, because occasionally these universes intersect, and this is where you get like these massive, like, universal crossover events that serve to reset everything usually. And it's again at a crossroads point in a story, and it just leaves it nicely set up for a fresh start. It's really confusing and really difficult to explain. If I've made it sound any simpler for you guys, then. But honestly,
I think.
Yeah.
I think the point of to take away from this is that it's inherently quite confusing.
Yeah.
And I don't envy your task in trying to explain all that, Greg, because I don't think there is a way to make that sound
any simpler.
simple.
No, there's not.
Yeah.
The best thing to take away from this is don't get too bogged down in what happened before when you want to start reading about a particular character. Forget about all these events and everything else, and just start with number one. Just pick any number one,
yeah,
and just start reading at number one, because eventually you'll start to pick up things anyway. Because as you read, you'll see things that you don't recognise. They'll reference something, and you'll be like, "Oh, what was that?" And then you'll go back to a Wikipedia page, and you'll go, "That's what happened, but who's this character?" And then you'll start sort of jumping around, reading about different stuff, and eventually you'll just know it. But that's yeah.
I mean, to be fair, I have a slightly different experience with that. Like, you talked about Spider-Man.
Yeah.
And I started with Spider-Man Unlimited because I knew that it was a finished story. And I actually didn't do what you mentioned. I didn't go to Wikipedia when I didn't understand something because I trusted...
Do you mean Ultimate Spider-Man?
Sorry, Ultimate Spider-Man.
Yeah.
You're correct.
Yeah.
I read it through start to finish without referencing Wikipedia or without looking for outside information because I trusted that it was a new story and it had a new beginning and everything that I needed to know was going to be revealed to me along the way. And then after the fact, I went back and realized that, maybe there were some things they didn't explain very well or that were deliberately vague because they tied into another Ultimate run. And I mean, the best advice we can give is just find a character you like and start at a number one, as Greg said, and just keep going until you hit a point that you feel like it's finished and you've got an idea of what you want to see next. And generally the story in itself will weave in and lead you to a different story from there. So for example, Ultimate Spider-Man introduces a bunch of the Ultimate X-Men, and then you think, maybe I'll check out the Ultimate X-Men, and it turns out that is a whole separate run that you can dive into if you so feel like. I don't know if you guys have any other input on that.
No, I think that's as much as we can explain for that.
Without going down the rabbit hole.
Yeah, without going too far down the rabbit hole. Yeah. So I think that's the simplest way to put it. And as I'm saying, just start at number one. Doesn't matter, what's happened, how many events you've missed, or you've not missed anything. Just start at number one, and eventually you'll pick everything up as you go along anyway, because you'll be curious and you'll read about things, and maybe you'll go back and pick up a graphic novel, a collected story of that character that involves that villain, so you know more, that kind of thing. So
actually, and one thing we haven't talked about, which is almost specific only to comic books, because I don't see it happening very often in films and TV. But there's this comic book term called Retcon, which refers to a retroactive continuity. And this is part of that inherent confusion, because what will happen is somebody will start a new story and, quote unquote, retcon certain details. So if in all the stories you've known about a particular character, a close family member has been dead, and that's what drives them to do what they do, some writers may retcon that out so that the character in question never died, and that's just the state of things now. And I think kind of it is you just have to go along with it and assume that you're going to be slightly confused at certain aspects, because
that usually happens at the end of like a universe changing event. So like when they have like these crossover events, there'll be like one big universe changing event, and that will change the fact that somebody died. They'll either get resurrected through Deus Ex Machina, or someone will get sent back in time to a point where they can stop it from happening, or something weird like that. And then doing that, the universe changes, and that's where you get your new number ones, and that's where you've got this whole retcon thing coming from, because it's been retconned that character did not die, or that character did not get superpowers, and this character got superpowers instead, so you have a different person being that hero. But yeah,
because part of it is like another usage of the term is like return continuity, and it's a way for them to sort of clean house and get things back to what happened before this last run, which complicated things tremendously.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's a lot to take in.
Yeah.
So shall we move on to something a little bit easier?
So yeah, I'm going to wheel away the blackboard now. and this is going to get handed over to my other co-host, Leon Everett, and he's going to give us a brief note on the difference between comic book continuity and cinematic continuity. So off with the heavy physics, on with something else. Go on, Leon.
Well, like with the comics and all their different versions and different continuities, the adaptations, whether they be cinematic or on TV, exist in their own continuity. And like for the big two universes, Marvel and DC, they're split between the MCU, the Marvel Cinematic Universe, but that stuff also encompasses the stuff that happens on TV, like Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. or the Netflix shows. And then you have the DC EU at the moment, which is Batman vs. Superman and Man of Steel and Wonder Woman. But confusingly, on TV, the DC universe is split, so you have a different actor playing Flash on TV than you will have in the movies. So you sort of have that weird thing to deal with. But generally, these are stories that are adapted often from, well, on the base of it, it's characters that are taken from the comics, and then new writers, producers, directors, or showrunners are then pretty much given free reign to create new stories of these characters. So what often happens is that you'll get something like Supergirl, and week by week she'll face off against a different villain that was also in the Superman and Supergirl comics. But that storyline will bear no real resemblance to how things took place in the comic. The main reason this happens is because, as we were just discussing, in the comic book world, a lot of these things are intensely complicated, and there's just too much. There's way too much baggage, way too much history, and to fit what the directors, writers, producers, or showrunners' plan is for their show, they will often pick and choose elements from the history of comics, and for the big two especially, they have like 90 years worth of history to deal with some of these characters. So what they can do, the benefit they have, is that they can go back and pick and choose runs and different narrative arcs and storylines that best fit what they want to do with the current characters. So examples of that you will have had is generally origin stories. A lot of the time a character has had like 3 or 4. They will pick and choose elements that fit best with what they're trying to do with that character. Historically, I'd say before 2008, generally when a comic was adapted, you'd usually have like the hero, the superhero versus a supervillain taken from that, and then different storylines in the past would have influenced that movie, and it generally worked as it was franchise based. So say for instance the Raimi Spider-Man films of the last decade, he borrowed bits and pieces from different comics to create his trilogy about Tobey Maguire's Peter Parker and Spider-Man, and he got the same with Nolan's trilogy of Batman films, which were unrelated from anything else going on with DC at the time. It was just set in Gotham to deal with Batman, and it was 3 movies that tied together and had a beginning, middle, and end. With the advent of Marvel setting up their own studio and getting the rights back to some of their characters, with Iron Man in 2008, what we got was the closest we've ever had to comic books universes being on screen. And with that, each movie plays as being part of a wider world and wider universe where characters from other films and possibly now the TV shows could appear and do appear in other movies, to the level where you have all these individual movies. You'll have a Thor movie and an Iron Man movie, and that will lead to the Avengers movie, which has all of these people in there. And then the flip side you get of this is that because they have to pick and choose and do what they need to fit what's best. So, for instance, with the upcoming Spider-Man Homecoming, don't expect it to follow the story of Spider-Man Homecoming, the comic, because the continuity in the comic at the time is completely different with what's happening in the movie universe at the time. So they've got to serve that master, which is this almost decade worth of films and continuity that they've built up in the film universe. And now they finally got the rights back to Spider-Man. They're going to try and fit that all in. And most of the time, I think Marvel have handled it quite neatly, but there are times when it can end up a bit messy. So the flip side you can get with this is that people who've been reading the comics for a long time generally see a character a certain way. And this is where you can get like people petitioning when they see the casting of a particular person as their favorite superhero, or they see a movie which has the title Civil War, but it's not exactly how it was in the comic. This is where you can get some friction between the fans and the adaptations. But generally, personally, for me, I want the cinematic or TV adaptation to fit its form. And what I mean by that is there are different considerations for film and TV than there are for comic books. And there's certain things that work in comic books that don't work in film and vice versa. So for me, as long as the spirit of the world and the characters and the storyline are captured, I'm fine. Though there are a few examples of films which attempt to translate the comic from page to screen. And I think they work better in some contexts, like the first Sin City film, but then they can sort of fail in other contexts, like with the Watchmen film. But at the end of the day, it's a nice way for people to get introduced to a lot of these characters, and it's a very good jumping point. Me, myself, Spider-Man, before I started reading the Spider-Man comics, way back when, I was watching the Spider-Man cartoon TV show and the X-Men cartoon TV show, which themselves adapted some of the big storylines from the comics, but in a way that would work for a Saturday morning cartoon. So for the most part, that's what you get, though there are situations where the cinematic equivalent of a character may not reflect the spirit of the characters established all those years by the comic books.
Do we have an example of that? Because I'm thinking Batman v Superman.
Nail meets head.
I know that some parties present may not agree with that, but that's exactly how I feel. That Batman v Superman doesn't respect or reflect the spirit of the characters.
I'm not going to get into it. It reflects and respects a certain facet. But yeah, anyway.
Yeah.
Now,
so yeah, I think
it's. I guess we should also talk about where you should get comics from.
Yeah, because I think we've covered everything. We've covered the formats. We've covered that continuities and retcons are inherently confusing, and that's something you shouldn't try and obsess over because it'll come as you read. And so, yeah, I think the most important factor is where do you get your comics from? And I know, Greg, you're a big proponent of going to your local comic book store to actually physically go and purchase your comics.
Yes, yes.
I mean, let's address. There's two different ways that you can get comics these days: physical and digital. So let's address the physical stuff first. Going and physically buying a book from a brick and mortar comic book shop.
Yes, the best way I think to do it is to support your local comic book shop. Go into your local comic book store and buy your comic books, your trade paperbacks, your graphic novels or whatever from your local comic book store. It's not necessarily always the cheapest way to do it, but comic book stores are, kind of like the lifeblood of the industry. We need them. When a publisher sells a comic, the artist and the writer, I think, gets the most money from the physical purchase. So if you buy a physical comic or in a comic book store and whatever, you're helping that, but you're also keeping the comic book store there. And comic book stores are a great place. They're a great place to go. They're a great thing to have in towns and cities. And if you've ever been in a comic book store, when you've been, you've ever been interested in comics and things like that, and you've ever walked into one, it's just a great place to be. It's a nice place to be. It's like local record stores. If you're interested in music, you support your local record store because it's a cool place to have. It's a cool thing to have in your city, in your town. You need it there. It's something that I think is culturally significant, and we should support them because we need them and we need to keep them. They're the lifeblood of the industry. Buy physical comic books from the comic book store. I mean, alternatively, there are other ways to get physical books. I mean, places like Waterstones will stock, they'll stock trade paperbacks, they'll stock graphic novels. You can even...
I should point out, though, Waterstones generally, or I think definitely doesn't... they don't sell periodicals. They don't. Issues. They sell trade paperbacks, whereas the local comic book store is where you would want to go to get
that's where you go to get your issues, your separate individual issues, your periodicals. You go to the local comic book store to get them because that's the best way to buy those. Graphic novels and things like that, you can get those in other bookshops like Waterstones. You can also go to the library. Most libraries now carry a graphic novel section where they'll have like some sort of like some of the more famous stories, so more the bigger Batman stories that people, stories that have earned critical acclaim, maybe things like that are the kind of things they tend to stock in the libraries. You can also...
Although, actually, if I can interrupt, because you'd be surprised, because I've been living in my area now for a good 3 or 4 years. It took me about 2-3 years to actually even step into my local library, which is like a fairly small library. It's not huge, doesn't have like stories and stories of books, but they have a really well fleshed out comic book section. They have lots of comics, and they have lots of manga as well. Like, I honestly was surprised at how extensive the collection was. So I mean, if it might give you an excuse to step into your library, because I know that a lot of people don't these days. Go check it out. I think you might be pleasantly surprised by that.
Another one that we need to keep around is local libraries. So go and support your local library. Go and get your library card and get your comic books from the library. Start reading the ones that they've got there. That's a good way to start. The last way you can get them is obviously the usual Amazon, etc. So you can buy them online, places like Amazon. And some cases you can order direct from publisher.
Okay.
And I know some comic book stores as well have eBay shops. So you can go on eBay and you can buy things from comic book stores through eBay, because people that run independent comic book shops will open an eBay shop as well and flog back issues online and things.
Yeah, I've actually found a bunch of relatively rare comics at my local charity shop, so it might be worth popping in there and having a look as well.
Yeah. And onto digital, I guess. So, Rahul, you want to talk about digital?
I guess, I mean, because I think out of the three of us, I'm the one who's the most on the digital comics train, I guess. I don't have a lot of space to keep all these books. I wish I did. If I did and I had all the disposable income, I would be spending loads of cash on physical books. But for me, it's easier to just have all of my comics that I want to read on my iPad. And I use Comixology, which is now affiliated with Amazon Kindle. And basically, I've set up subscriptions. So for my favorite runs, it automatically takes the money out of my PayPal account and has them ready to read every Wednesday when they're released. Just I open my iPad and they're there. I personally love that. I do kind of miss the pleasure of having a physical book and flipping through, and there's some conveniences you miss out on by having digital comics. For example, it's harder to flip through pages to go back and refer to prior scenes and stuff. You can't have two books open at the same time next to each other to compare different scenes or whatever. But for myself, not having the space, the benefits outweigh the negatives. So yeah, I really like Comixology. I love how they present their stuff. I love how easy it is to navigate their storefront. You could also go to the publisher's own website. I know that Image, for example, has their own app. They have their own site, even though they sell their stuff on Comixology, and it's all digital rights management, DRM free on Comixology as well. You can, I think they're maybe a little bit cheaper, but only can be accessed through PDF downloads or their own app when purchasing through them. And I think a lot of different publishers do have that. Maybe just check into the different publishers yourself. There are various other DRM free sources. For example, Humble Bundle. They tend to do a bunch of comic books every so often. In fact, recently they did Image's 25-year anniversary where they but they had a collection of quite a large collection of trades and stuff that you may not have heard of, that you can, gives you a good taster into what they have. And I think also a lot of libraries these days have online versions of their own libraries for novels as well as comic books. So you can borrow, quote unquote, digital versions of books and comic books from them. So maybe just check out if your local library does that service as well. I think... I know Marvel specifically has a Netflix-style subscription service. I don't know if DC does. I know a couple of these other places do. I know Comixology does have a pay X amount of money per month and get access to all of these comics, but I personally don't think Comixology's range is very good for what they're asking per month.
I don't like the idea of that either.
Yeah, it's hard to know where your money's going, really. I don't know why I don't feel the same way about Netflix, but yeah, on Comixology, it doesn't feel right. I want to buy the book that I want to read and make sure the artist and creators are getting the money from that purchase.
The difference for me lies in the fact that with something like Netflix, I'm going to watch it, and I'm probably only ever going to watch it once or twice, maybe at most. I'm not going to want to go back and rewatch it. I'm not going to want to look at it again and appreciate it again. As much as I am a comic book, because that's just with me with movies and TV shows. I mean, there's some movies I will go out and buy a Blu-ray or a DVD because I think they're great films, and I would want to watch them over and over again because they're awesome. But there's certain things. I mean, like with most stuff, like most entertainment watched, for me, I don't want to say it's not throwaway, but it's not something that I hold in such as high regard, like it's something that I would read. So, I mean, with comics, because I like to appreciate them and I like to go back and look through the art, and I like to... I'm one of those people that likes to sort of look at the art and be like, oh yeah, this is, and think about that a little bit and enjoy it in as an art form. So I will like to own a comic because I will like to be able to go back to it whenever I want. And the danger with a subscription service is when the subscription ends, that's your comics library gone. That's what I don't like about it.
I think I agree with that.
Yeah.
That's how I feel. And for myself personally, I'll purchase the comic books digitally in the issue format when the issues come out because I'm impatient and I can't wait for the trades to be collected. And then what I'll do is when the trade is released, I'll wait a little while, maybe wait for it to go a bit cheaper, and then purchase the physical trade if I really like it.
Yeah.
I do that quite a lot. I have lots of repeat purchases for these kind of things. One thing I didn't mention about digital comics, if you do get DRM free versions, these tend to be either in PDF or CBR format, so .cbr, which I think translates to .comic book reader format. And you can find CBR readers and PDF readers which are specifically for comic book readers. I think that Android and iPad, they have lots of different versions. I think the one that I use on iPad is Comic Zeal. And the one that I used when I had an Android tablet was Perfect Reader, I think.
Perfect Viewer.
Perfect Viewer.
Perfect Viewer.
It's the one I use, yeah.
I see, yeah. But we'll put a couple of links to these things in the show notes.
Yeah. So I guess we should give people some places to start. So we're going to have like a sort of short little list each, a rundown of good places that we think you should start. So think places to get started on comics, good starting points that we know from our own experiences. So Ray, you're first.
Well, actually my very first comic run that I read from start to end, which got me into understanding how comic book runs work, is one we mentioned earlier, Ultimate Spider-Man. I think it's fantastic. It's like 120 issues in total. I read them through start to end. Completely loved it. Another one I'd recommend is X-Men: Days of Future Past, if only just to compare how different the comic of the same name as the film is, how different they are to each other. You might be surprised to find how short the comic is compared to the movie and how completely different the plots are, apart from maybe one or two crossing over points. Other than that, my favorite graphic novel ever is Watchmen. And my favorite current ongoing run, which is not finished and we don't have an endpoint in sight, is Saga, which now has 2 beautiful hardback collections. So I think the first hardback collection is maybe the first 8 or 10 volumes put together. They're huge and they're gorgeous. I'd go check them out if I were you. How about you, Leon?
Yeah, I'd say for me, I've split mine into sort of rough themes that I think cover a wide gamut of places that you might be coming from when wanting to start a comic. So, as a good starting point for superheroes, I would recommend Frank Miller's run, Batman Year One, from the 80s. The thing that I think why makes this so good is that it's a collected story, beginning, middle, and end, and it removes any, or I should say, a lot of the baggage that you might have from a character who's been around since the 30s. And what it does, it's a sort of semi-reimagining of Batman in his first, Bruce Wayne in his first year as Batman. And the thing that's so great about it is that it recontextualizes Gotham, and it just creates this new world that brings back some elements that you're familiar with, whether no matter how much exposure you've had, but also is a fresh sort of starting point in terms of how this world works. And I think it's a nice, easy read to get into. If you're coming from a more literary background and you're jumping off onto this from being an avid book reader, then I would highly recommend Lock and Key by the author Joe Hill and artist, I always forget his name, Gabriel. Oh, I put it in the show notes. I feel bad.
Gabriel Rodriguez.
Yes, I thought it was Rodriguez, but I wasn't 100% sure. Yeah, Gabriel Rodriguez. And that is a really cool, horror-esque in some ways story. So if you're familiar with any of Hill's novels, it's in a similar sort of tone and theme. And I think that's a good starting off point, because with that one, it reads in ways like a book. It doesn't have superheroes or weird stuff. It doesn't have superheroes or like weird powers or anything like that. Instead, it's a nice sort of fantasy horror tale that I think is really good going in, and a really good, I would say, gateway drug into getting into comics. And the run itself isn't that long as well, so there's not that many collected editions that you need to read to get the whole story. If you're looking to get into something that is finished but is also quite fast-paced and sort of feels like it's a cable TV show, like something that would be on HBO, I'd highly recommend Why the Last Man, which is... not to go into it, but the basic story is that pretty much every male mammal on the planet has died, apart from a guy and his pet monkey. And it covers a lot of interesting themes, scenarios, and stories. And I think it's a good starting off point. I had a big gap between where I was big reading comics as a teenager, and then there was a little bit of a gap at the end of my teens, early 20s, and it was going into my local library where I picked up the first volume of Why the Last Man, that got me hooked on that, and got me hooked back into comics and graphic novels. And then finally, I would recommend, if you want something easy, something fun, and something that has a lot of references to other stuff, especially if you're a gamer, I recommend Brian Lee O'Malley's Scott Pilgrim series, starting off with the first volume, which is called Precious Little Life. I'd highly recommend that. They're fun, they're quite easy reads, and there's a lot of affection for music in there as well. And I just think... I think it works well as a jumping off point also, because especially with the new color editions. The artwork's so nice and so eye-popping, and they're really fast reads, and they're something that like stand out on your shelf, and they're very good for like getting other people into them who are probably pushed back when they hear someone talk about comics.
Just to add to that, if you are going to pick up Scott Pilgrim, definitely go for the color editions. They're gorgeous. Like, they just add a lot more to it. Don't go for the black and white ones. Go for the color editions.
I'd agree.
As far as my recommendations go, anything that is any number one. Start with any number one. So you see a character you like on TV or in a film. You've been watching, I don't know, the Batman Nolan films. You just pick up a number one, a Batman number one. Actually, Leon already covered it, but Batman Year One's a great place to start for that anyway, because Batman Year One is now, when people talk about the origins of Batman, that's the kind of stuff that they're talking about. That's how people, that's like the sort of the taken origin now, the taken mythology is Batman Year One. That's what people say is, and people say, yeah, Year One is where Batman started. So go with a number one, any number one. Walk into a comic book shop, look for a character you like, go through the trades on the shelf and find trade number one, and just start there, because that's always a good place to start, number one. Because and if you start at number one and you carry on, you start reading it, and after issue 3 or whatever you don't like it, stop reading it. It's fine to do that. It's fine to put it down, and if you don't enjoy it, don't feel guilty about not finishing it. Just put it down and pick up another number one and keep going and keep going and keep going and doing that, because for me that's the best way to do it. That's how I did it. Like I described at the start of this, it's like my approach to comics has always been through exposure through other things. So like I'll watch a cartoon or something, like the X-Men cartoon. I was like, that guy looks like a badass. I want to read about that guy. So I'll go and find a comic involving Wolverine, and I'll read about Wolverine, and then I'll see something in the Wolverine comic and that's referenced or an event or whatever, and I'll be like, oh, that sounds interesting. So I'll go and find out what that is, and I'll be like, yeah, maybe I want to read about that as well. So then I'll go and get the comics that, or a graphic novel that's got that event in it, and I'll read that, and I'll be like, this is so cool. And then I'll see something in that event that I don't recognise or another character, and then I'll go on from there and buy another book. And that's how I did it. Just very bits and pieces, very schizophrenic and sporadic, just all over the place.
And this is that rabbit hole we were talking about earlier.
Yeah,
like, it's so easy to fall down, and it's great. That's part of the love of it. So
what I'm saying to you is, don't be afraid to fall down the rabbit hole. Just walk into the comic book store, buy a number one, and then if that number one takes you on a weird journey, just go with it. Just let it. Yeah, just follow it. Just follow the breadcrumbs. Go wherever, It's interesting and it's fun, and it's like you're in charge of your own sort of consumption. So you're taking from it what appeals to you. You're not just reading it out of duty, start to finish. Even if there's bits of it you don't like, you're just taking the bits that appeal to you, which is the best way to do it, I think.
Yeah, I would agree.
And I guess that wraps it up. So just to finish, thanks for listening, guys. We have been Ace Comicals. You can find us on Twitter at Ace Comicals. You can find us on WordPress, which is acecomicals.wordpress.com. You can find us at www.acecomicals.com, which is our newly launched website, through Fireside. So that all our podcasts will be hosted there from now on. You will be able to find us eventually on iTunes, and you can also find us on Facebook, which is Facebook/Ace Comicals.
And do we have any way of contacting each other specifically? So if I wanted to send a question directly to you, Greg, where would I find that?
Well, you can get me on Twitter, which is @Batto, so BATTOU, or you can send an email to acecomicals.gmail.com.
And Leon, how about you? Where can we reach you on the internet?
Best place is at Leon Everett on Twitter.
Cool. And for myself, it's @Monkey, so that's MOONKEH on Twitter.
And that wraps it up. So thanks for listening, guys, and get involved, ask us some questions, and
go read some comics.
Yeah, go read some comics.